All right, welcome back to our listeners here. Welcome back to Unhidden Podcast. As always, I'm Drew, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Lorena. So welcome everyone to another episode of ours. Drew, I think this one is going to be the first one where we have a guest. So I think I'll let you introduce him, but I think this is kind of like the first attempt to bring more educational content for everything that is going on with autism. So who do we have today?
Yeah, so I'm joined here by a good friend of mine, Dr. Eric Smith. Eric and I have known each other for years, and this whole conversation stems from a study that Eric had posted on social media that really captured my attention. And I think it's worth having a conversation with our listeners about because I learned a ton, and I think it's really useful information. So, Eric, can you maybe do a quick introduction of yourself and a little background and context as to who you are?
Sure. Well, yeah. First, I'm not like an autism doctor or an autism researcher. So I would say I'm not one of the real doctors. I'm a psychologist. And I'm not a real psychologist. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I'm interested in how the mind works more than I'm interested in what is pathological and what's not pathological. I do end up doing a lot of work surrounding autism and autism adjacent disorders like Fragile X and Rett syndrome and that sort of thing. Partly on the regulatory side and partly on the scientific side. So part of what I'm doing is figuring out exactly what this current administration is trying to do with regards to autism, how that impacts different drug treatment classes and that sort of things, and non-drug treatment classes. I'm one of the people who, when I take an autism test, I pass it with flying colors. And if I ask a doctor about it, they'll say, and I think this is the correct response, is this impacting your life in a negative way? And my answer to that is no. In fact, I'm with influential people like Temple Grandin in thinking that I think it can be a bit of a superpower if we're talking about the same sort of autism. And I think it's worth distinguishing between sort of profound severe autism where you need a full-time caregiver to, change diapers and make sure you don't hurt yourself versus like I see the world in a different way and I recognize visual patterns and stuff like that. So I'm interested in it from there. Even if we're not talking about pathology, I'm really interested in knowing how other people's minds work. And we're actually doing some projects with the nonprofit that I work with, the Institute for Love and Time. We are allying with the telepathy tapes people to look at how autistic non-speakers process information, and often it's non-verbally, non-formal operations, and I think it's very interesting that people are able to think without speaking. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you for joining and sharing the expertise that you do have here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let's jump into, I think we'll just do a quick kind of, Cliff's Notes version of this study. And we'll post a link to the study in the show notes so that everybody can go read this themselves. There's a lot of really detailed information about biomechanics and biochemistry that flies way over my head. So clearly, that's one of the reasons why we bring in somebody like Eric, which, it's while it's still not his area of specialty, he still knows a lot more about it than I do personally. So really glad to have you on the podcast. So let's dive into this like Cliff's Notes version of the study. So this study examined mice, and it looked at the effects of exposure to the chemical BPA in utero to see if BPA exposure could potentially be, causing autistic presentation in mice. And what they found is that there was at least there appeared to be a causal factor of BPA exposure in utero only for the male mice that were exposed in utero. This did not happen to the female mice that were exposed in utero. So congratulations, women, on having the X chromosome. You don't have this effect. And they were able to track autistic presentation in these mice after they were born, primarily through monitoring social interactions of the mice themselves. They were able to track this kind of back to some biochemistry and biomechanical stuff in the brain. They were able to track it back to a specific chemical, and they were able to treat this using a supplementation of a substance called royal jelly, which is a natural occurring substance produced by bees, and that this treatment actually helped to mitigate some of the effect that this BPA exposure in utero was causing these social presentations in these male mice. So that is a Cliff's Notes version. So I'm going to pause there, and Eric, you obviously have read through this study. Did I miss anything that's critical, or did I misrepresent anything that's critical that the audience needs to like hear you correct me?
No, I think you represented it really well. They're thinking that the primary pathway is through aromatase, which helps convert male hormones, so androgens, into female hormones. Males and females have them both, but into estrogens. And I think one of the important sort of follow-ons is that we also do see in human studies some similar effects. So like there's a study in Australia finding that boys that had lower aromatase activity were more predisposed to having autism-like symptoms. So whenever you have like a mouse model, it's important to be like, does this translate to humans? And it looks like it might. So.
To Drew, like I guess that was one of my first, where I want you to jump in, Eric, and you can jump here right now or like in a little bit. But I think like the first thing that caught my thinking was, if this study was at the prenatal stage, as I'm understanding it, what were how can we correlate this with early childhood? Because I feel like the same study is talking about like prenatal, but then the so-called solution of the base stuff, it's of course after prenatal. And so that's what I am trying to understand, like what is the relationship between those two things. So very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think often they look at prenatal exposure because it's easier to control, meaning like they can take a good observation and then look at downstream outcomes. But there's kind of like this spectrum of when potential influences on autism can happen. So one of the things that the current administration is looking at is de novo mutations, which explain they're associated with about 30% of autism cases. These are cases where it's an exposure in the parents, usually the male, that is impacting the DNA of their gametes, so their sperm or their egg. In the case of the male, it's the sperm. That isn't necessarily, it's not like you're passing on a heritable trait. It's actually changing the DNA of the gamete. So there was this everybody blew up about like, oh, it's genetic. Well, saying genetic doesn't necessarily mean it's heritable. So those exposures can impact these de novo mutations in the gametes. But also, so that would be genetic, but also you have an environmental exposure that's happening in prenatal environments. And then also you have postnatal exposures, which get really tricky. I'll tell you why. So one of the ways where you're able to tell how much of it is genetic and how much of it is environmental is by doing twin studies. And when you look at twins that share 100% of their DNA, identical twins, versus twins that share half of their DNA, non-identical twins, the identical twins are much more likely to have the same autism status, like twice as likely as the non-identical twins. So this suggests, and it looks like that explains maybe like 80% of the variance of observed autism outcomes. So this suggests it's maybe like an 80-20 or a 70-30 split between genetics and environment. Those are really cool studies because you don't have to worry about ubiquitous exposures. I'll explain that too. When you take it outside of the prenatal environment and you're looking at environmental exposures, you probably are familiar with like a regression model. So a regression model is basically figuring out how much of the variance in outcomes, so how much of the variance is whether somebody is presenting as autistic or not, can be explained by these predictors. It can be explained by the variability in these predictors. So in order to really assess if one of these predictors predicts autism, there has to be variability. When you're talking about a ubiquitous exposure like microplastics or something, where they find that everybody's got microplastics in them, there's no variability, so that doesn't correlate with the downstream variance in exposure, so that doesn't end up in the model. So it could be that we're severely underweighting environmental exposures, but the twin studies really help with that. So that's why I always would go back to twin studies as gold standards. And even like the platinum standard would be like twins who are separated at birth and then they're raised in different environments. But that's such a low number of people, it's hard to really draw strong inferences from that.
That was exactly, I love that you said that, Eric, because one of the questions precisely that I was going to bring for you was like, kind of what were the exposure levels, if they knew it when they studied, compared to what you just said, the typical human exposure that we'll have to food packaging that we know right now it's a really big trend, or receipts. Like I literally know people that they don't even take the receipt in the pharmacy anymore because now it's a thing, right?
Yeah.
Or like all the microplastics that you just mentioned. So I'm wondering in what setting, in what environment, in what, and against the regular stuff that we are all dealing with.
Yeah. Oh, so I mean, I grew up in Arizona, and I know Drew did as well. And where did you grow up, Lorena?
Mexico City.
It's pretty hot, right?
Yeah.
We would leave full milk jug style water bottles in the car, and they would heat up to be like 100 degrees, and we'd go out and we'd take a swig of it, and we're like, oh, that's gross, and it tastes like plastic. So I'm really, really interested in like these sorts of plastics exposures. I think that we're not going to be able to find high certainty evidence. Like I know RFK Jr. has promised that by September we would know the cause of autism. I think that's a very dumb statement to make. I think it's really cool to look at potential causes of autism with an open mind. And I think when we talk about something like air pollution, there's a pretty strong association, and that is not just in the prenatal environment. That's in the actual person's environment. So things like BPA, it's kind of lower certainty, but like the evidence is starting to build, like this study that we're looking at. Things like vaccines, I think there's not a lot of evidence for, but I think, you know, if you're going to recommend something or require that something is given to everybody, then, you know, do the studies again. Like it gets tricky because you can't ethically withhold a treatment that you think is effective. So it's hard to have control groups in those studies, but I think it's worth being very, very certain about those things. So there's all kinds of like possible exposures. Atrazine is another one where any of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, which I think that's the pathway being proposed in this BPA study, is that BPA is an aromatase inhibitor, and it's messing with your ability to convert androgens into estrogens. I think one of the ways that I like to approach things is people experimenting on themselves with interventions that have a low risk of adverse events, and seeing what it does. So I personally take a DIM. It's like an extract from cruciferous vegetables that helps with estrogen metabolism. And I think that it helps. I've taken, 100 things to see what it is, and most of them don't do anything. I think DIM helps a little bit. I also take N-acetylcysteine, which is supposed to help with neural inflammation. And I take that because they are finding that some of these treatments that are working on neurodegeneration and neural inflammation are showing a reduction in symptoms in autism, but also in autism adjacent conditions like Rett syndrome. So they're working on neural inflammation. And then if those work, then you can work your way backwards and say, hey, we really, really need to be looking at things that are causing neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration. There's also the gene therapies, which gene therapy for autism is really, really tricky because only about 20% of autism cases are linked to a single rare gene being inherited by the parent. Which that's the only case where we're good enough to go in and say we're going to change that gene and it's going to change the expression of some protein or something like that. And even then you have all sorts of protein toxicity issues you have to balance out. If anybody is going to have a gene therapy, it's going to be the Rett syndrome people because it's a monogenic. It's related to one gene, like one trait, one gene. It's a really strong relationship. If they're not able to do it, then I don't think we're going to see gene therapies for anything like autism for maybe ever. If they can't crack that code. So I'm kind of hopeful that things go forward there. But also, in most cases of autism, do we actually want to have a therapy? Right? Like I find, especially if I'm working with people like Drew, that we communicate extremely efficiently. And I think it's possibly because we share an information coding and expression style. So I think that's an open question as well. Like, is it bringing us distress?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned, Eric, and this is related, actually kind of related to two things you mentioned. So obviously we've got the twin study that shows that, identical twins have a much larger presentation where both twins end up with autism than non-identical twins. Now, my question is this. You also mentioned that there was a chance that some of this could be caused by a non-heritable gene from the father. That is obviously not a hereditary thing. So do those two things conflict in any way, or would those two things actually support one another as being consistent with one another?
Yeah, I mean, so it's just another source of genetic predisposition. I think Temple Grandin makes a pretty strong case that maybe we should be treating these as different conditions depending on their genesis, right? And their what sort of genes are involved, or even categorizing based on severity, that sort of thing. With the de novo gamete mutations, I think the strongest candidate there isn't so much. Well, okay, maybe that's not a good. The strongest candidate there is the father's age. Like, men are waiting longer and longer to have children. The longer they wait, the more mutations their gametes accumulate. That's not to say that what's causing those gamete mutations. That could be genetic, stressors, and you just have longer to accumulate those. So I think you can operate. I think they're not mutually exclusive to say that it's environmental or genetic. And it's also not mutually exclusive to say that some cases are linked to these de novo mutations. Some are linked to, they call them polygenic common variants. This is like 50% of cases where it's just like, there's a whole bunch of genes that are common to everybody, and those expressions are a little bit different in the sum of it. It's kind of a hand-wavy explanation right now. It's like, and then there's maybe 30% are caused by these rare gene variants, 20 to 30%. So I think so much of it is up in the air that I wouldn't exclude anything, but I definitely don't think those are mutually exclusive explanations. There's also epigenetics, which is like, that messes with all those probabilities, right? Because it's like, you can be predisposed to autism and not have it, and like something can change the way that your genes are expressed, and how and whether they're phosphorylated and stuff like that. And that can happen for rare genes, it can happen for common genes. So that epigenetics is like a big opening for exploring some of these environmental factors especially, post birth.
Well, and that you mentioned something that I also wanted to talk about is I know that since autism was discovered, it's gone through kind of the definition of autism, and what's categorized under autism has gone through several kind of like evolutions, right? Like if I read this properly, it sounds like ADHD actually used to just be considered part of autism, and now it's a completely separate diagnosis. So I'm wondering, are you seeing any kind of evidence that there might actually be multiple different, I'm not going to use the term disorders, I'm just going to call it things, that are currently all categorized as autism because they present similarly, but due to the underlying causes and biomechanical mechanisms involved here, they might actually be completely separate, unique things that just have a really similar presentation. But that also might be part of the reason why we call it a spectrum is because it's actually, 6 or 7 different things that we've lumped under a spectrum. Like, are you seeing any kind of evidence around this?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's certainly severity is one way that you can carve things up. I also think if you look at things like non-speakers versus speakers, I think that's a worthwhile categorization to make. Like, are there people who are trying to use the same method of information processing as everybody else, but not doing as good of a job at it, quotes, as good of a job? And are there people who have a completely different way of interpreting information? So with the non-speakers, they're really, really good implicit pattern recognizers. And I think I don't have a really solid answer to that because I think it's all up in the air, but I would recommend reading anything by Temple Grandin. I think she's pretty smart about that. She's a big animal, they frame her as an animal rights activist, but she basically finds win-win situations for food processing companies to treat their animals more humanely while increasing their efficiency for how they process the meat. And she's really, really strong at sort of seeing things just that nobody else sees. And she wrote a book called Visual Thinking, I think, which is, I think is a pretty good primer for how she thinks about it. But yeah, she's a big advocate for we need to call these things different things and not just lump them all together. I also see the other argument. So there's this argument about why are we seeing so many cases of autism? And it's like, well, it's that we didn't diagnose it before and you just called the kids slow or something like that and they didn't get the support that they needed. And now they're getting diagnosed. There's also the argument that there's actually more cases of autism popping up. And I think they're both valid arguments, especially having worked in pharma for a while. I can see there is a pathway that over-medicalizes things. Like when you look at something like, okay, we've got Paxil. What are we going to sell it for off-label? Well, social generalized anxiety disorder? Okay. We need to make a case that generalized anxiety disorder is a thing, so we're going to lobby these doctors to convince them that it's a thing, and that's going to increase prescriptions of Paxil. So there are those mechanisms that actually do lead to overdiagnosis and overmedicalization. In the autism spectrum disorders and autism-adjacent disorders, I think it's less about overdiagnosis or underdiagnosis and more about misdiagnosis. So often people with Rett syndrome will be diagnosed as autistic, and then they don't get the support they need for Rett syndrome. And within autism, I think that there's a lot of variability in how the diagnosis should be chopped up. Here's my hope. As we get better at genetic diagnostics and we can really, really look at different genetic pathways that are leading to autism, maybe that helps us chop up which sort of presentations are present for different genetic predispositions. And I think that would be really interesting. And they're getting really, really advanced on the diagnostic side of things. They could it's like the, what was the Theranos?
Oh, Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos.
Yeah.
But now it is getting to you take a blood draw and they can do a whole lot of stuff with it. It's not a single drop of blood, but
I think though, Eric, I agree with you that genetic testing specifically, and I know this because my wife happens to work at a genetic company. And we do see the increase of testing, at least even in adults, in an adult population, on rare diseases, including, of course, autism. However, that would only give us the answer for a piece of the puzzle, right? The other piece, which is why we started this conversation on the environmental exposure, I think that's an entirely different world that I don't think we're even close to get an answer from there. And so going back a little bit to that, when you said, especially right now as the rates have increased alongside, at least in the US, how do you think they even distinguish correlation from causation?
Yeah. Well, first, I think there is a relationship between the genetic and the environmental exposure predisposition part. So, if you look at like the genetic underpinnings for something like aromatase deficiency or glutathione deficiency, so like how much more trust would people have had in the public health vaccination programs if we said we're going to screen everybody for likely adverse for conditions like glutathione deficiency or any of these other sorts of underlying conditions that we think might be associated with adverse drug events? Because what public health often does is it commits the ecological fallacy where they say you are 1% likely to have an adverse effect in the population, and then they'll say this person is 1% likely to have an adverse effect. But that's not true. That one person is either 100% or 0% likely to have an adverse effect, depending on all of the variables that person foster, all the characteristics of that person. So if we could take a lot of that guesswork out of it and say we're gonna really, really make sure that we're not accidentally dosing somebody with a bunch of mercury if they don't have the glutathione necessary to excrete to metabolize the mercury. I think that would go a long way to rebuild trust, because trust is in a really low place for public health right now. So I don't think we can separate the two, really.
I think on that same point or on that same line of thinking, my brain was also kind of jumping to, well, are there populations with different, let's call them deficiencies of, what do you say, glutathione or something around that? Have they studied those external patterns in different populations that could potentially serve as natural control groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm sure that, so this is probably beyond what I know of the literature. So I'm sure there's more than what I know here. But it's always really sensitive if you're going to say this group is different from that group. But I mean, we do know some things like Tay-Sachs disease is much more prevalent in Jewish populations and stuff like that. We also know that populations that practice consanguinity, so people who breed with their cousins, they are much more likely to have genetic disorders that pop up and accumulate those. And then you're going to see rare genetic disorders pop up. So places like Saudi Arabia, I think Israel is also pretty insular. I think it's less about cousins there and more about self-selecting for only mating with your in-group, their ethnic group. So anytime we see those populations, we should expect to see higher rates of rare genetic disorders pop up. When we talk about who is sensitive to what chemicals, I don't think there's much good work on it. I mean, we know there's people who don't metabolize alcohol very well. Beyond that, I'm not super aware. I'm sure somebody's studying it, though, but I'm not aware of it.
I would be very interested in that, because even the most basic one, lactose, right?
Yeah, right.
But now they know it's a hormone that you either have or you don't have. So anyhow, Drew, what else is in your mind?
That was my hope behind 23andMe and the promise of personalized medicine. Is that, I can see if I'm lactose intolerant. Let's see if I'm also predisposed to having an adverse drug event. And they started going down that path. The FDA kind of put handcuffs on it. And I can understand it's also a dangerous path to go down. But the FDA has its own, it's not personalized medicine, it's precision medicine initiative, but it's moving really, really slowly. And 23andMe, I was hoping would move a little bit quicker, and now it's selling all of our data to to the highest bidder.
So I think when I see studies like this, one of the things that I see is for those folks that want treatment. Because again, to your point earlier, Eric, like, some folks may be totally fine with who they are and with where they are in life, and they don't feel that they have any kind of they wouldn't categorize any of their autistic presentation as being negative in any way, shape, or form. And so they may not want a treatment. But for those that do want a treatment, when I see studies like this coming out, I see two things on the horizon. Number one, preventive measures. Preventive measures prevent people from getting it in the first place, right? So the more we know about the underlying causes, the more proactive we can be in preventing these things from happening. Like, let's prevent BPA from getting into humans, particularly, mothers that are pregnant, and we will reduce the instances of autism, provided that this study ends up being validated and ends up being true. We have preventive measures, but then we also have potential treatments. To your point about, people experimenting on themselves, I read this treatment. I was like, wait, what the hell's royal jelly? Can I go get some of this? So I went and got royal jelly supplements and started supplementing royal jelly. And did it help? I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. But that would only help if,
for sure.
What's that?
You're looking a little Queen Bee-ish today.
I mean, maybe it changed the grays in my beard, so I've got like a striped bee pattern going on here or something. But that would only help me if my particular version of autism was caused by BPA exposure in utero. It wouldn't help me otherwise. So I'm seeing potential preventive measures, potential treatments. When you see a study like this come out, do you see the same thing, or do you see something different, or do you see more? Like, what do you see as where this takes us in the future?
Yeah. So I really like when a study can put out something that suggests that a most likely extremely harmless, low risk treatment that could also impact a whole bunch of other pathways positively is worth a try. So when I see something like vagus nerve stimulation, which is kind of all the rage in the trauma-informed therapy circles now, and I think maybe it helps with autism. So what's the cost of trying vagus nerve stimulation? It's almost zero. So you might as well give it a shot. When we start talking more about peptides and small molecule pharmaceuticals, and even something like cannabis, like CBD, which they're working on with autism, I think that there are a lot more potential costs, risks in the risk-benefit analysis. So that's where I'd like to see researchers and potentially governments doing more safety testing. And then if it's safe, then I don't really think you need to do efficacy testing. I think if it's safe, just let people give it a shot. The chances of me taking DIM being deleterious to me are very, very low. And I found that it helps. Same with NAC. I took royal jelly for a while. I didn't notice much difference. Maybe my skin quality, because if I'm producing more estrogens, then that makes sense. But yeah, why not biohack a little bit? Even with most of the peptides that are fairly innocuous, but you have to make sure that they're being manufactured with good manufacturing practices, and I'd like to see more research with the peptides as well.
It's kind of tough because I get to see both sides. Like I like the kind of segmentation you did, Eric, on verbal against nonverbal, and that for me is like the profound, really profound levels to the not so profound. And I happen to have both within my family, right? So I get to see everything. So for me, more the question on test it on yourself, which I'm also doing, by the way. I did take them as well, but it was for another situation that I was having. And I'm also, I mean, probably, Drew, that's going to be something interesting to bring someone on supplementation, right? Like a specialist in supplementation, because what I think for me has served really, really good in the past, probably like 8 months, is colostrum, because there's another development around the microbiome stuff where, like, when you were a kid, like, probably it didn't develop very well, and now, etc. But I think, Eric, to the point of the people that cannot afford to just test these little things without risk, what would you think we could do, I don't know, almost as a community or as a society to challenge these findings?
Which findings do you mean specifically?
I mean, the studies that are coming out around, like, well, do the B thing, or like do the VIM or the glutathione. The question is, for the people that cannot be testing here and there because they truly do need a solution, what's out there? What's the hope? What's the expectation?
I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for a community being able to hold people, regardless of their differences. Like there's evidence from places like Nice, Belgium. Nice? Oh shoot, I think that's a town in Belgium that.
Nice is France, isn't it?
Right, that's Switzerland maybe. Okay, there's a town in Belgium, I can't remember the name now. Anyways, they take in people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they integrate them in the community, and they end up having better outcomes than pharmacotherapy does. It's part of the reason why I'm really interested in understanding how different types of people with different types of autism process information about the world, because the more we know their minds, the more belongingness they have, the higher the sense of belongingness they have in their communities. I don't think that is the whole. That's the whole picture. But let's say you're taking an neurodegenerative drug, and that improves your symptoms by 10 or 20% to the point where you're able to go get a job, or your parents aren't full-time caregivers and they're able to go get a job. But those are big, like those small changes end up having big impacts. And let's say you get to the point, it's like with like antidepressant drugs. Like if I take an antidepressant and it means that I'm able to get up off the couch and go out into the world and be embraced by the world, being embraced by the world is going to make up the other 80%. I don't know what those numbers would be for autism, but like I feel like the more we understand it, the better we'll be able to integrate, and that integration itself is going to be a treatment modality.
What I always wonder when we talk about treatments, you mentioned that, and that like for you have really, really good pattern recognition. And I'm the same way. I have like really good pattern recognition. And it's part of the reason why you and I communicate so well when we work together, is that we kind of speak this same language. It would be really interesting if treatment could get to the point where it could say, well, if you were to take this supplement or this treatment, it would impact the social presentation of your autism, but not impact your pattern recognition. Right. Like, I don't know if we could get that specific and targeted, but that would be like the ideal scenario.
Where you keep the superpowers without the super foibles. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Superman without his kryptonite. Like, get rid of the kryptonite, right?
The biggest. I agree with that. I don't know. I mean, genes are tricky because you barely ever get one trait, one gene. And if you tinker with one gene, it's going to affect everything else. So I think that's tricky. But like, if we're talking about gene expression, then maybe it's different. So maybe if you're taking things that help support your epigenetic environment, then maybe that helps. I think a lot of it ends up coming, like when you're at a place where you're able to at least understand a little bit about your own mind, then it becomes easier they call it masking, but I would call it more like code switching, where I know what people expect in a social situation. And that was going to make me sound a little bit like Dexter, but I'm probably not a psychopath. I know what people expect, and I recognize those patterns as well, and I can present in a way that people mostly aren't creeped out when I meet them. And sometimes it's too big. Sometimes I'm way too big or way too unserious in a serious situation because I don't read the emotions in the room correctly. But also, I have a really supportive partner who helps me with that stuff. If you want to see, if you want to see a really neat show, in my opinion, there's a show with Amy Schumer and Michael Cera called Life in Beth, or Life After Beth, or Life Before Beth, or something like that. And I think it gives a really strong account of what it's like to live with someone who's just barely on the spectrum. And it's like, oh, I recognize it. And my wife will be like, oh, you do that too. And I'm like, okay. So that helps. I think the more that we understand about those, it's like if I deal with a narcissist in the workplace, I'm going to deal with them differently. If I deal with somebody who, doesn't have legs, I'm going to deal with them differently. I'm not going to, invite them out for a jog or that sort of thing. So I think it's important that we know what people's processing styles look like.
I love that.
I looked it up. It's Life and Beth. Life and Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah. You were right there.
Yeah, that's right.
I think we're getting at time, but I think what an enlightening conversation with someone that is a lot more into the weeds than Drew and myself in all of this conversation. I personally want to thank you, Eric. I think you have helped me understand and digest a little more the study from the very first time that I read it. This is why we do this. So thank you for being here. Drew, any last words for Eric?
No, just again, thanks, Eric, for joining and sharing your thoughts. I mean, this has been super enlightening and educational for me, and I hope it's the same for anybody that might listen to this. So, just really appreciate you joining here, Eric, and appreciate our friendship.
Yeah, me too. And thanks for having me. And I think this is really the best thing that we can be doing is building understanding. So I think you guys are awesome.
Thank you. All right. Lorena, anything you want to say to close out the show?
I want to invite the audience to, if you like this episode and you want us to do more deep dives into specific topics, just let us know and we'll be happy to do it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you again, Eric. Really appreciate your time. And as always, thank you, Lorena, for being a great co-host.
Of course.